Here we are in Ways and Means. It's sometime. It is 10:35. And we are going to continue work on modernizing our telecom taxation system by starting off with a report from Ted Barnett about Vermont Universal Service Fund. You want to join us? Thank you. And as Ted's getting settled in, just want to, Maria Royal is not available today. And so we are not going to do a walkthrough of language, and likely revisions are going to be made before we see the next version of language. Such is life in this universe. So we'll hear from folks about their thoughts about past language and future language without the context of the language. And we're just going to make the best of it, everyone. Sorry. Ted, thank you for your report.
For the record, Ted Barnett, Joint Fiscal Office. Also, before I begin talking about the report, because the Universal Service Fund allocates a percentage of revenues to the Vermont Community Broadband Board, I'm disclosing that I am Williamstown's town delegate to the CV Fiber Governing Board and on the Finance Committee. So just keeping that in mind.
Yeah, of course.
So yes, I'm good.
They're lucky to have you, but she mumbled it, so you might not have heard the comment.
I appreciate that. It is, Vermont is very small. Yeah, so going to talk about some of the general findings of the report, provide a background for the programs in the fund, also spend a little time talking about the difference between 911 and dispatch. So we're clear those different worlds have different funding conversations and groups working on them. So yes, just going to talk about the report. It is literally fresh off the digital presses. It was published on the General Assembly page this morning. Yes, you guys are getting a first look at it. So yes, ran through our outline. So talking about the structure of the Universal Service Fund, the following programs are funded through the Universal Service Fund, starting with the Vermont Community Broadband Board. They receive 1/6 of revenues kind of off the top of the fund. The following programs are funded with the remainder, starting with the fiscal agent who collects and administers the revenue side. There is a telecommunication relay services and equipment distribution program. This allows folks with hearing or speech disabilities to place or receive telephone calls. Vermont Lifeline is next in the order. This offers a $4.25 monthly discount on voice plans. This is different than the federal Lifeline program, which includes a discount on both broadband and voice services. And next in the statutory order is the Enhanced 911 Board. This system reports phone number and location information to certified call takers to allow more efficient routing to the appropriate public safety personnel. And then finally, is the Connectivity Fund. I'm just making sure all my Zoom bars are out of the way. It's both the Connectivity Initiative and the High Cost Program. Because of this statutory funding order, the Connectivity Fund has not received funding in the past couple of years. The Universal Service Fund has a long legislative history. It was created by Act 197 in 1994. This established the structure of the fund and the E911 board. The statewide E911 system became operational in 1998. Fast forwarding to Act 190 of 2014, the Universal Service Charge is set at a consistent 2% of retail telecommunication services. Before that, it was set by rule every year. The retail communications charge is paid for on the voice portions of your wireline, landline, telephones, wireless, and interconnected VoIP, which is voice over internet protocol. This is a service like Vonage. With Act 79 of 2019, it increased the Universal Service Fund charge from 2% to 2.4%. 100% of that increase was allocated to the Connectivity Fund. And then in 2021, that 1/6 of revenues was allocated to the Vermont Community Broadband Board.
And just reminding folks, the frame that we've talked about previously for this conversation is that, one, where the money goes is not so much our business. Having the funds be full is our business. In this particular conversation, that becomes even harder to differentiate than usual, but we're gonna do our very level best. And that as we modernize these taxes, some of which I think are from the 40s, we're not necessarily looking to, overflow the funds. We are looking to make sure that we have funds that will grow at a reasonable pace into the future.
Right, and I will talk about the natural rate of increase with different funds and decreases, and yes, we'll definitely get there.
Yeah,
Sure.
Is the VCBB allocation a sixth of revenues, or is it that 0.4%?
It is the one, so if you look at the 2.4%, the difference between, then the 0.4 is like 1/6 of revenues. So I like to say 1/6 of revenues, so you don't think it's 0.4% of overall universal service charge revenues. So you'll hear folks kind of say that interchangeably. It's 0.4% of the universal service charge or 1/6 of revenues, but it really is of the $5 million generated by the universal service charge. It is 1/6 of that revenue comes off the top and goes to the Vermont Community Broadband Board.
So I guess instead of going to the connectivity fund, it's going to the community broadband board?
That is correct.
Oh, okay.
And so I think part of the context for that was like the connectivity fund existed at DPS first. And then we created the VCBB as a sort of like new kind of modern structure as we sought to really expand our investment in broadband. And it became its own, it's a public-private quasi-independent body. But I guess I maybe this doesn't matter, but just wondering if we were to ever like change the size of the fund, like 0.4% is a specific dollar amount, a sixth proportionate to a pot. And so if the pot grew, would it be 1/6 of the growth, or would it be a static number that's the 0.4%?
Yes, as clarifying the question, as the size of the pot would grow, that would change the amount proportionally dedicated to the board. And so we incorporated that in our modeling as we looked at more sustainable revenue options, right? You increase the pot and the broadband board would get a little bit extra because they are a proportional piece.
Just on the PEG fee hits the same, which does the PEG fee hit and which does this hit and which hits both?
So PEG has its whole separate funding conversation, but it's
Yeah.
not a part of the universal service charge. PEG is funded through a franchise fee, and that's a certain percentage of cable revenues, and that's kind of a whole separate.
So this does not include cable revenue.
This does not include cable revenues.
Okay.
This is a retail charge on your landline, a certain portion of your wireless service.
Okay.
And if you have a VoIP connection.
Okay, just wanted to keep those two separate.
Great. That is, yes, I think because this all is kind of in telecom land, it's those conversations can't get muddled up.
Can you explain VoIP a little more?
Sure. So VoIP is like an internet phone plan. There are two different types. There's interconnected VoIP, which runs through the normal kind of telephone switched network. So that would be like Vonage. I don't know if you've heard of Vonage. They advertise a certain percentage, or they advertise. Things like Skype are also voice over internet protocol. That's called like nomadic VoIP. Because it's kind of internet to internet. So if you think of the easy way to think about it, so this all talks about interconnected VoIP, and these are assessed the charge because it's using that switched network that telephones would use, that cell phones use. And so like if it's just computer to computer screen name, if you're not dialing a telephone number, that's not included.
Representative Demmer,
So-
Sims, and then we're gonna go to the next slide.
So VoIP has to be attached to a telephone number. Without a telephone number, it's not VoIP,
It's
is that correct?
so for the purposes of this, it had interconnected VoIP is generally associated with kind of like a phone. It accesses the like public telephone switch network.
Yeah.
If it doesn't kind of run through that system, that's nomadic VoIP, and it's not assessed any of these charges. Yep.
Yeah. And just the kind of framing here, right, is like, if you have a line that you can call for help, we assess this charge to help support the people who answer 911 if you need help. That kind of access, right?
Yes, that is the nexus.
Thank you.
So on the next slide, we're going to spend a little time looking at this flow chart that is adapted from something on the Enhanced 911 Board website, and talking about the process of 911 calling, again, to differentiate 911, which is a part of the Universal Service Fund, and dispatch, which is a different process and structure. And so starting, a person calls 911, that call enters the 911 system, and two things happen to it, whether it's a call from a landline or a cell phone. For a landline, it gets connected with the database. With wireless, they kind of have a third-party GPS coordinate system. And so the first thing 911 does is figures out where that call is coming from. When they figure out that location, the call gets routed to a public safety answering point. I will show the geographic distribution of the PSAPs. There's 6 in Vermont. And so once it's determined the right PSAP, it tries to route that call to the PSAP. If there's not a caller available, they try and find the next closest available operator. And so that call is then delivered to a certified call taker, who then gives pre-arrival instructions and then also connects with the appropriate dispatch agency to send emergency response personnel, whether that's fire, police, what have you. And so here's a map of the 6 PSAPs and the towns they serve. The 2 largest areas here are the areas served by the Westminster Vermont State Police PSAP, and then also in Williston, there's a Vermont State Police Center that serves as a PSAP, and those 2 areas receive the majority of 911 calls. And so now to get to the fiscal part of the picture, this is charting the historical revenue trajectory of this 2.2. Originally in 2015, it was a 2% charge, or 2.4% more recently. And it shows that the revenue was almost $7 million in 2015, and it's decreased to $5 million by 2022. And the bottom of the table shows the year-over-year decrease. Yeah, so a pretty steady downward trend over this time period. This is primarily because of this chart here. This shows the number of voice subscriptions based on different types. So the green line is wireless telephones. Your blue line is wireline. The FCC calls it wireline subscriptions. This is a typical landline, and then interconnected VoIP. The number of landline subscriptions has decreased since 2008 from more than 300,000 to almost 100,000. And meanwhile, wireless has increased from 400,000 to 600,000. And this is an issue because wireless telephone services have kind of 2 components. And so there's a portion of your plan cost that is associated with voice, which can be assessed the charge, and a portion of your plan that can be assessed is like considered data, the data portion of the plan, and that is not assessed the charge. And so I looked at my phone bill this summer, and of my $70 a month that I pay for Verizon services, when I looked at the amount they were charging, the amount of Vermont Universal Service Fund, the charge, it meant that my associated plan costs associated or connected with voice was $8.33. And so a smaller percentage of wireless telephone costs can be charged the Universal Service Fund or the Universal Service Charge.
Ted, may I interject to find out? I mean, I can kind of understand various reasons for that to be the way that it is, but is there any guidelines for the wireless providers of how to make that determination, how much goes to phone and how much goes to internet?
That is a great question. Yeah, no, I will look into that. I know the FCC is puts out a lot of regulation around kind of communications providers and how they provide services. But I will check in and see if there's anything explicit or how carriers determine this.
So if I might, so that's something that would be regulated at a federal level, not at the state at this time or in the future? Is that possible?
I don't know the answer to that question. Yeah, but I will provide, it's a really good question.
Yeah.
It's a question for Maria.
Okay, excellent.
Mhm. So in line with the chart of subscriptions on the last slide, this is the picture of Universal Service Fund revenue and expenses. That also shows the blue. You can also see kind of a downward trend in Universal Service Fund revenues and a corresponding kind of matching decrease in expenses. And that's just simply because they're limited by the amount of revenue that's available. The large kind of expense in 2018 is associated with a kind of more one-time larger allocation from to the connectivity fund. Because of the statutory order presented early in this presentation, E911 bears the large share of revenue decreases from the Universal Service Charge. This shows kind of a long look back at the enhanced E9 or the enhanced 911 board revenue and expenses. You can see that their revenue in fiscal year 2017 was 4.7 million. That is decreased to 3.4 million in fiscal year 23. And to bridge the gap, there have been a series of appropriations, one in fiscal year 21, one in fiscal year 23. There's an appropriation in 24, which is not on here, and the GovRec budget also has a $1.3 million appropriation to the Enhanced 911 Board to kind of make up for the fact that there's just not enough revenue in the fund. And so, with this framework in mind, I tried to estimate, carry forward the decrease in revenue and time. And, but before doing that, looking at what the fund would need each year, starting in fiscal year 25. These needs were determined both by historical trends for things like lifeline expenses. And then for E911, we took budget request been inflated by a pretty conservative 2% inflator. That's in line with CBO kind of long run expectations for PCE inflation. And so revenue needs are projected to increase from 6.6 million to 7.1 million. In fiscal year 23, the Universal Service Fund generated $5 million in revenue. So it's showing a gap.
Everything's good.
Two questions. Have we learned anything about the fiscal agent fee and service and whether it might be more cost effective to do that in-house, or if there's a reason for that arrangement?
I know, I will dig into that a little bit more. I know that, the fiscal agent costs are kind of proportionate to the amount of revenues. But yes, that is kind of where the fiscal agent comes in. I can see kind of the original decision to have a fiscal agent happen a long time ago, but I'll look into it and see the motivation.
Is that a common arrangement for a lot of special funds to have a fiscal agent? I'm saying no.
Yes,
No, okay.
there is some nodding. I don't know. I know for specifically like universal service funds, it's not uncommon to have a fiscal agent. across state government, harder to generalize, but yes, in this area for sure.
And then you're projecting Lifeline decreasing and then that's continuing the trend around wire lines.
Yes. Yes, that's exactly right. And so the revenue picture, I think, will be coming up in a successive in the next slide. Yep. Yeah, so this is showing based on the revenue needs in the previous slide and kind of carrying forward the year-over-year decrease in universal service fund revenues, the difference between revenue and need in each fiscal year. Fiscal year 25 is a little more than 2 million, but that increases as kind of the needs of programs in the fund increase to 3.2 million in fiscal year 29. So since the chart was looking at kind of long-term sustainable funding, wanted to understand where we'd be in the future and the size of the revenues needed.
And this is without the sort of, I guess I'm not aware of a policy committee doing the work to figure out if the existing appropriation connected to each of those purposes is sufficient to meet the policy goals of those there. And so I think that's definitely, anything we do would probably need to have that layer added to it as well, outside of this room in the policy committee.
Yes. Yes, and I was trying to freeze kind of like.
Yeah, no, I appreciate,
Yeah,
you,
yeah.
yes, absolutely. What you did made a lot of sense. I just sort of want to add that nuance to it.
And so this is kind of giving a little bit, so this is now given background, gave some estimates of revenue and need. This is starting to evaluate different options for the Universal Service Fund. One is to simply say the retail telecommunications charge, we would continue this going into the future. In order, looking at the size of the base and the rate of decrease, the percentage charge would have to increase fairly substantially and increase over time in order to generate enough revenue. And so in order to generate enough revenue, currently it would have to be 3.5% of retail telecommunications. And that increases by almost a full percent over 5 years, just to make up for the fact that base is decreasing over time. And so the point here is that it would be hard to it would require repeated action to look at the size of the base, kind of forecast how much is needed, and are we, is the percentage retail charge lining up with how much is needed by each program in the fund. And that figure increases pretty substantially over just 5 years. The next option is what is in H657 at the moment is a per line charge. Before discussing the fiscal implications of a per line charge, we're differentiating between prepaid and postpaid wireless users. Prepaid voice subscribers buy a certain amount of minutes of data kind of upfront when they need them. Or postpaid subscribers receive a bill at the end of the month for services in that preceding month. We make that distinction because in H657 and in previous proposed legislation, only postpaid prescribers were paying the per line fee. And prepaid users would continue to be charged the 2.4% retail charge. This arrangement avoids charging prepaid consumers every time they top up their minutes, which could happen more than once a month. And so you want to get a certain share of the amount of minutes they're buying. And this is directly connected to voice. With that in mind, this table is showing that other states, many other also use this distinction between post and prepaid wireless consumers. So nearly all wireline and wireless consumers are due a per line charge for funding 911. But with prepaid, 30 use a per line charge, 20 use a percentage charge. Now for the fiscal piece, we took a look at.
I feel like you buried the lead there. All other states have a per line charge.
For E911, so Vermont is unique in that we fund the entirety of our 911 services out of a universal service fund. New York provides some E911 funding, but we're definitely unique. And so when looking at E911, I looked at both how folks do a universal service fund, how they fund that within their state, and then also looked at E911. Yes, that's exactly right. It is. We are pretty unique in all our states.
We've
For the
had this
most-
percent and that folks have. We won't assume the 10, but it has maybe contributed to a decline in revenue as people move to wireless, but the number of lines stayed consistent and pretty much every other state, yeah, and it's the 911 portion with this per line would be much more stable.
Yes, exactly. And the number of lines has increased. So when we, in Vermont, from 2016 to 2022, the number of lines in the state increased by 3%. So there's a natural rate of increase. So looking at the amount of revenue generated, you have revenue generated by the per line charge, and then an additional approximately $250,000 that's generated from prepaid consumers based on a 2.4% retail charge. And so, for example, a 70-cent per line charge, like what's in H657, combined with the additional revenue generated from prepaid consumers, gets 7.28 million. And that is a considerable increase from the 5 million generated by the retail charge. Like any policy lever, there are advantages and disadvantages to the per line charge. Simplicity, a line would be charged 70 cents per month. If it's a line, it gets charged 70 cents. It is also stable. As I mentioned, the number of lines has increased 3% between 2016 and December 2021. And this is obviously contrasted with the steady decline in the size of the telecommunications space. There are some disadvantages. A per line charge is slightly regressive because that per line charge is the same regardless of someone's income. That could be addressed through several different levers. It's also yes.
Do folks with more income tend to have much more substantial phone plan?
Folks with more income.
Like, is it more regressive than what we're doing now? I guess that's my question. I don't really have any sense of like what kind of phone plan people sign up for and if that has any correlation to anything else in their life.
The only real like regress, like I would say that the main distinction is between pre and postpaid consumers. So folks who are lower income are more likely to be prepaid consumers.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. And postpaid, it's correlated to the size of your family, perhaps. But yeah,
Your
that's,
patience at shopping,
yeah.
your loyalty to a brand from 40 years ago. Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Also, this can be complicated to figure out in a commercial context. So if you're a business and you have a bunch of big extensions, but fewer lines that go in and out of the building, that is something different states have either put a cap on the number of lines that go in and out of a business. And then finally, inflation is a factor here. Although there is a natural rate of increase in the number of lines, it's not connected to inflation. So if inflation's increasing more quickly than the number of lines in the state, that could erode kind of the real value of revenues generated by the fund or by the charge. So that's it on the per line fund. We also explored kind of the question of to what extent is the E911 board and the other programs in the Universal Service Fund kind of a public good that could be funded through the general fund. An agency of administration report recommended moving E911 to the general fund. And that would cost kind of the full amount of what would be needed by programs in the Universal Service Fund. And also kind of continuing the fact that the legislature has provided appropriations to the E911 board to support their operations. The main consideration is that it requires funds or programs in the general fund to compete with funding within the broader budget process. And that's kind of the risk, is that this is a public good, that when someone calls E911, we want to make sure that folks are answering the phones, and there's complexity within the budget process as well. This last piece that we looked at was kind of looking at, for most of the report, we took the assumption that things would continue in the same structure and size and allocation as it is under current law. But also looking at kind of how our Universal Service Fund compares to other states. Vermont is one of the only states to fund E911 out of the state level Universal Service Fund. And this piece that Representative Sims was talking about, because of the structure of the Vermont Universal Service Fund, you have two conversations happening kind of implicitly. And so if you're focused on E911 and you want to increase funding to make sure E911 stays whole, because of the mandatory 1/6 allocation of revenues out of the Universal Service Fund going to the broadband board, more funding gets generated for the broadband board. And so these things are happening at the same time. And so many other states have per line charges for E911 specifically. That's pretty much the norm. And then have a separate charge for the Universal Service Fund. Considerations with this type of arrangement is it injects more complexity. Consumers start seeing more charges on their phone bills. The FCC and the federal government places more scrutiny on a charge that's dedicated to for 911 services on a consumer's phone bill. And they've started to take action for states that collect an E911 fee and then divert it for other uses. And states risk losing federal funding if they leverage E911 funds for things they're not intended for. So that brings us to some of the conclusions of the report. Again, our current structure is a bit of an outlier. Alternative funding approaches, the current retail telecommunications charge is a declining base. It's not long-term, not sustainable. We, estimated that the funding in 2025 would need to increase by 2.1 million. And with inflation, the total annual cost of the Universal Service Fund would increase to about 7 million by fiscal year 29. And those revenues could be generated with a 70-cent per month per line charge.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Questions from anyone at this point? Okay, switching very slightly to the next agenda item.
Sure.
Trying to navigate the awkwardness of not starting with the statutory language from Maria. So acknowledging that again. Representative Sims, do you want to say anything to sort of kick us off into the next section of our conversation here?
Sure, and I think we did have a walkthrough now, I mean, like a lifetime ago.
Yeah.
It's like 2 weeks ago. So maybe just as a reminder, a sort of small working group of us spent a fair amount of time on this in the off session. And our focus was really trying to address some of these deficit issues and move towards a more kind of competitively neutral approach towards telecommunication taxes and fees to support the public benefits that are in our current construct. And so the bill 657 has kind of 4 pieces. It has the cloud tax, which this committee has spent a fair amount of time talking about over previous years. It has the construct that Ted just walked us through around switching to the per line charge to stabilize the Universal Service Fund. It also spends a fair amount of time looking at the telephone and personal property tax, which was, what was it, the 40s that we established that? It is primarily focused on phone infrastructure, as the name suggests, and the bill contemplates moving towards a broader, more competitively neutral approach towards telecommunications infrastructure assessment. And then it has some pieces around the state right away where we have given authority to assess the right of way charge that the department has public services has not implemented, and add some reporting requirements and a little bit more heat around that. I would say that we've been in ongoing conversations with stakeholders, including tax, and are contemplating an alternative approach around the telephone personal property tax, which would be just repealing that current structure and looking at just a fair market value assessment of the property tax for that infrastructure. But so future drafts are being iterated, but that council is not here with us today. So
And Ted, do you had sort of some updates on numbers related to that statute? That would be great if you could share that. Thank you.
Sure. So I can, so kind of broke it down to its constituent pieces. Some of the information I have is, around the as introduced communication property statewide assessment. So I can run through what we have and kind of give a sense of, and talk about real and personal property on the grand list to provide some context for how those things generate revenue for different funds. Great. So starting, there are a bunch of different pieces that have fiscal impacts in this bill. And so there's the first piece of pre-written software accessed remotely. There's the universal service charge updates to a per line fee. There is the communications property state assessment, which we'll kind of put a pin in for this conversation, it sounds like, and then the Agency of Transportation right-of-way lease fee. There's also the 1% capital charge for access management organizations that I didn't put in the list. So starting with pre-written software accessed remotely. This is built on a presentation given by Pat last year. But we'll talk about how these services, what currently is the scope here. And so we're primarily talking about 3 different types of cloud services. There's software as a service, platform as a service, and infrastructure as a service. And so you'll commonly hear them as SaaS.
And we've passed
Yes.
this and sent it over to the Senate more than once.
Several times.
Yes.
Just want to name that. Everyone's seen this slide before.
Yes. So I'll go quickly if that would be.
That would be great.
Okay, perfect. And so some examples, just to bring these things back into our mind. Software as a service includes things like TurboTax, QuickBooks, Microsoft Office Online, Dropbox, MailChimp. There's a whole field of them. Platform as a service includes Squarespace. So if you go on Squarespace and design your own website, that's included in platform as a service. Infrastructure as a service is things like Amazon Web Service or Google Compute. And so this is like computer infrastructure, like server kind of infrastructure that you're gaining access to.
And I remember from last time we discussed this, that like 98% of the market in that third category is owned by those 2 corporations. Also, and I don't know if you're going to get to this, since the first time we voted this out, and certainly since the first time we discussed this, way more states are doing this than before. I don't know if you have a slide about that.
I don't have a
Okay.
slide about other states, but about the size of the market and how large it's growing.
Okay.
Yes.
Many more states are doing this than the first time we talked about it. But I don't remember if it's like the majority or close to the majority.
Just so quick, this question, on the slide before it, just so I understand, infrastructure as a service. And that you said 98% is owned by 2 corporations. Can you give me that slide before? Sure. Amazon Web and Google Compute. How are those different from a web design space? Can you give me an example? Just tell me what that is. Just tell me.
So to the extent I interacted with it, I needed So instead of having, like, if you had an office network that ran on a server and it was like a physical machine that sat in your office, that had an internal, for an internal kind of like,
Can you start again? Now I got distracted.
totally fair. I did a little bit too. And so, right, so for a small
In an
office, yeah, and you have a server, which, you know, the state of Vermont, we have them, and so you can store files on the server, you can use it to run printers in the office. Instead of having that physical machine, that lives on the cloud. And so that infrastructure is something you purchase from Amazon or Google to kind of have that machine space. And so it exists on the cloud instead of being a physical thing
Okay.
that lives in the office. And so those things are changed. Some things that are not changed. Streaming services like Netflix, Spotify are currently subject to the sales tax. Things that are installed on a computer as opposed to being accessed remotely, those are currently subject to the sales tax. Custom software. So if you're a business that needs some sort of specific client, you know, like sale lead tracking platform, and
Or
you,
like the Department of Labor getting a new computer system.
exactly, yes. And then tech support as a service is non-taxable. And so the Department of Taxes has this lovely summary of things that are currently taxable versus non-taxable. On this list, you can see the infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and SaaS. Those three would move from non-taxable to taxable. This piece. This is a slide about the rate of industry growth. It's pretty dramatic. BEA digital economy data shows that cloud services are increasing by over 23% per year. And so global public cloud revenue is estimated to be 679 billion.
Scott, what was the first year that we passed this out of this committee?
Oh, I think if you passed that before my timeline, it's gonna, then I think at least 2 or 3 times, yeah.
All that money in the Ed Fund, could have been in the Ed Fund. Okay, sorry, back to you.
And yes, the United States is a leader in this kind of space. And yeah, the size of the global market was 242 billion. This is million billion. I will check what one it is, but it's increased pretty dramatically since then. And so because of this rate of increase, we're showing this increase is higher than it was even last year. Our estimate is for the first year of implementation, 20.7 million. That's because it's 11 months as the tax gets booted up, and then 22.2 million for a full year of implementation. So that's the pre-written software accessed remotely portion. The next one, I'm going to go really quickly through this because you just heard me talk for a while about it. So we know all about the charge. So H657 would kind of in line with the analysis in the report, would repeal the 2.4% retail telecommunications charge for wireline and postpaid wireless services and replace it with that 70-cent per line monthly charge. It would also maintain the 2.4% retail telecommunications charge for prepaid wireless in line with all the analysis in our report. Our estimate is that it's that per line charge would generate 7.28 million. That's an increase of 2.31 million from current law. One piece I wanted to mention is the effective date on the charge is January 1, 2025. And so there'd be 6 months of the telecommunications charge and 6 months of the per line charge, which may inject some complexity in having carriers kind of do both systems for a fiscal year. And so looking at the Universal Service Fund, I looked at fiscal year 2026 that would have the first full year of a per line charge. This shows all of the different revenue needs of entities in the fund. It includes the 988 crisis hotline. I'm still working with folks at Department of Mental Health to understand exactly what the need would be. So I'm putting a pin based on fiscal year 2020, kind of like 2025 initial data. That number could be adjusted. The total revenue need at that point is 7.33 million. Their request is a little bit higher than some of the early numbers I saw. The per line charge can be adjusted, and for each 5 cent change, you generate 500,000, an additional $500,000. So to the extent that piece, once we kind of like narrow that in, that amount could be adjusted. So this is the piece that sounds like there might be some movement around. I can talk a little bit about the differences between real and personal property owned by telecommunications company that's on the Ed Fund. Or I can kind of just skip this entirely.
For folks who are involved in the redrafting, does it make sense for us to skip this for now or to go through it?
I would.
Okay, let's do it.
Yeah.
And seen all these numbers.
So, great. Onwards, thank you.
Sure. So under current law, we have kind of two sources of revenue from telecommunications companies that would be adjusted by H 657, the telephone personal property tax and real and personal property that's owned by telecom companies that is on the grand list. The telephone personal property tax is telephone companies and interconnected voice line owners. They are assessed at 2.37% of net book value on that property. It generated $2.4 million in general fund revenue in fiscal year 23. And so property assessed, the telephone personal property tax is not taxed by municipalities, or the property is not on the education fund. And so the next piece is real and personal property. And so real property, right, is land and any structures attached to that land. This is land, buildings, and in telecommunications, wireless towers in some cases are considered real property. In other cases, they are considered personal property. I have a fun flow chart that can kind of, it breaks my brain every time I see it. And so personal property is, this definition is from 32 VSA 3618. And so this is personal property that is used or held for any trade, business, professional practice, transaction activity. So this includes furniture, boats, machines, kind of stuff, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, I have a clarifying question. I'm going to apologize for it, but asking because it's really meaty. So if you are a telecommunications provider and you have one of those like little buildings full of machinery that basically is meant to relay the service, would that be real property or?
You mean like a
Or both?
substation?
Yeah.
So that's based on my understanding, and I will ask Herbie
Because there's
to
a building
confirm.
And there's machinery.
Yeah, so the machinery inside would be personal property. The building itself would be real property. Yes,
I know that's.
No,
Thank
that's a
you.
great question.
I
it's a great question. And this stuff gets really weedy really quickly. So
I see that.
yes. And so zooming into telecommunications providers. So again, towers are considered real property in some cases. And we primarily, to get a sense of the magnitude of like real property owned by telecommunications providers on the education fund, we looked primarily at towers. And a preliminary estimate, again, going into the grand list, it's complicated to pull this stuff out. These towers have a value of between $500,000 to $2 million in the Ed Fund. For personal property, this is a way broader bin. This could include wires, conduit, lines, power equipment, kind of all the stuff that's in the substation, switches. And so for cable companies, this property is included on the grand list and generates revenue for the education fund. And this is approximately $1.8 million. For other telecommunications companies, it's considered the same as business personal property, which is exempt from the education fund. And it's a tax in the municipalities that tax personal property. And so there are 42 municipalities that tax machinery and equipment and 8 that tax inventory.
And then others that don't.
That don't, yes.
That's
Yes.
And will you talk a little bit more, maybe now or later, about what we know about ability to assess these and value them and net book value again, fair market value and.
And that could also be a Maria question if it's not a you question. Feel
Yeah.
free to defer.
Yes, I would be happy to defer. I did have a conversation with PBR. It sounds really complicated. And a lot of municipalities, it's complicated for them to have the capacity to go out there and assess if you're a volunteer lister. Really hard. Yeah, so
Is there some parallels to, so we just received a request to sort of shift, how other complex properties are valued and that happens at the state level. Are there some parallels to that?
many other states centrally assess this property because of the complexities of getting this right.
What, and is it appropriate to just have you touch again on the like net book versus fair market? I mean, 'cause it seems like the things that were bought a long time ago have sat there may have had a depreciated value, but at the same time, if you were to sell that to someone else at the fair market value, it might have a very highly valuable, and so there's this approach towards assessing, and then also not even sure whether municipalities are really looking at this stuff, or certainly not necessarily in a consistent, uniform way. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, so net book value, yes, can incorporate quite a bit of depreciation. I don't have the figures off the top of my head, but I have a table for the telephone personal property that shows the depreciated value versus the value that is like residual net book value that's being assessed the charge. I will share it with the committee because the amount of depreciated property is pretty substantial.
I'm also want to make sure we have time for our other witnesses. So we will stop. Yes, let me go back to you.
Great. Yes, so moving along, this is the flow chart that I sometimes look at.
Right before bed.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yes, if I ever lying staring at the ceiling and just think of this chart, it's better than cheap. And so, right, it depends on the type of whether the land is owned or leased, depends on whether how fixed the tower is, depends on whether it's radio or a cell tower. It's really complicated. Exactly. So I'm just presenting it to show kind of how complicated these things can be. I'm going to put a pin on just giving us a frame of the type of property. I'm going to kind of skip the changes in 657 because it sounds like they might be moving around and in the interest of time. I can give some examples though of how current these types of equipment or real property are assessed. Cable lines are assessed as cable personal property and are on the statewide and local grand lists. So education fund and municipalities receive revenue. A router owned by a non-public internet provider currently is assessed personal property, or it's considered personal property, which is exempt from the education fund, but taxed by the municipalities that tax that type of personal property. A cell tower depends on where it falls in the flow chart. Yes, so this is looking at some revenue implications. I'm going to move forward. I will say that any type of look of this is kind of it's difficult to get at, and there are a number of caveats. There we are. So moving to there's the next piece is some capital payments to access management organizations or PEG-TV. Organizations currently, individual AMOs negotiate with cable companies to determine the amount of revenue they get for capital expenses. Commonly, this is 0.5% of cable revenues. The statewide average presented in the kind of financial viability of PEG TV providers, the average they found in that report was 0.66% of cable revenues. That report forecasted that the system generates about $774,000 in 2024. And so this is different than the 5% franchise fees. A real quick run through of that section legislation. And so the final piece is the AOT right-of-way charge. An estimate of the revenue to be generated from that charge currently isn't feasible, primarily because the legislation required V-Trans to assess a reasonable charge of payment. So without clear understanding what that reasonable charge is, you just can't get to a number. It's also the percentage of state highway right-of-way that is utilized is not clear. And the number of providers kind of using that space is also not clear. However, there are two kind of rate structures that other states have come up with as examples of what they considered reasonable charges. New York State does different charges for whether the cable, so this is for fiber optic installations, whether it's in the air or underground. It also differs depending on kind of population density. So in this table, tier 1 is places like Buffalo, Rochester. Tier 2 is Binghamton, and tier 3 is kind of the rest of the rural upstate area of New York. And then Virginia, they have.
So if the AOT had followed statutory requirements and proposed a structure, it might have looked something like this.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep. And then Virginia has a kind of per line multiplier and looks at the $1 for each foot of new installations. Their charge generated 35.6 million. And that charge kind of gets apportioned out to folks who are either have lines or have installed new equipment.
It's just one rate, doesn't matter where you are.
Yes.
You're hillbilly Virginia or Northern Virginia, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
I was wondering about that as well, Representative Meadows.
Oh, it's rugged down there, let me tell you.
And so this is kind of a preliminary look at some of the numbers. Pre-written software access remotely, 22 million for a full year implementation. The per line charge generates an additional 2.3 million for Universal Service Fund revenues. Looking at the size of kind of real and personal property that is on the grand list, that's anywhere from 2.5 to 4 million. And then obviously the AOT right-of-way charge is to be determined.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
It's really helpful.
Yes.
So a quick question, and then we're going to hear from some witnesses. Yeah, thank you.
Quick, I thought there was some kind of a charge for each tap on the tree. Each place where these businesses hooked into the system.
Full attachment fee,
That is in proposed legislation.
but not in this committee act.
Yes.
There's a bill in the Environment and Energy Committee. I don't know the bill number, but that does that.
Is it coming to us?
I have no idea. I genuinely have no idea. Yeah.
Just bring a note to ask if those come.
But we're about to hear from Lauren Glendavidian, who might tell us. She's inside the computer. Thank you very much.
Of course.
I missed that question from Representative Brannigan. What was it?
The question was, hello and welcome. The question was about the pole attachment fee. And I explained that it was in a bill that wasn't in our committee, and someone asked what the bill number was. And I said, you'll probably tell us all about that.
Yes, well, I'll tell you a little bit about it. It's H575. It's in House Environment and Energy on the wall, and it's in Senate Finance is S181. It's
Thank
called the Community Media Public Benefit Fund. I'm Lauren Glendavidian. Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee for the opportunity to testify on H657. telecommunications tax modernization. I am the founding executive director of CCTV, Center for Media and Democracy, which is based in Burlington. And I now serve as the public policy director, working on behalf of CCTV and Vermont Access Network, which represents 24 community media centers working all across the state, of which I think you are all quite familiar. VAN is a nonprofit organization that represents its members in matters of mutual concern, including the effective operation and advancement of public, educational, and government access services and channels throughout the state. We are also referred to in Rule 8 as access management organizations, and we have a complex mission that makes us as local media production centers a combination of town hall, local newspaper, town library, public school, and speaker's corner. Just not to dive too deeply, but we do produce collectively about 18,000 hours of programming a year. In addition to the services that we provide in media education, we help to keep the wheels of democracy turning, and we're identified as an essential service by the legislature during the pandemic for the technical assistance we provided to cities, towns, and community organizations to continue being able to meet virtually and in hybrid settings. Over the past 40 years, communities across the state have built an extensive network of PEG channels and community media services based on, and this is quite important, the community needs and interests of members of the community that were demonstrated during multiple Public Utility Commission proceedings dating back to 1984. The Public Utility Commission is authorized by the 1984 Cable Act to be the franchising authority for the state, and they're able in that capacity to specify the conditions for cable operators to do business in the state and to grant them 11-year certificate of public goods. These CPG conditions include PEG access channels, capacity, and funding, both operating and capital funding, as was just previously referred to. And as written in the legislative history of the 1984 Cable Act, these public benefits are in exchange for the commercial use of the public rights of way. Since the 1980s, the PUC has earmarked Vermont's cable franchise fees. So the PUC is a franchising authority, and as such, it is allowed under the 84 Act to require franchise fees of cable operators. In many states and cities across the country, these franchise fees are simply put into general funds if they are collected at all. In other states, or in states, they are also dedicated for public educational and government access purposes. Vermont is very dense with PEG access, and that is because we have had a state regulator who has earmarked the franchise fees for public purposes, PEG purposes, since the 1980s. So 5% of cable operators' gross revenue is used to finance PEG operating costs. This is labor, this rent, just basic operating costs for these centers. The franchising authority is also allowed to require the cable operator to provide an additional capital contribution. And in Vermont, this hovers around 0.5%. Some of the smaller centers receive a little bit more than 0.5%, but 0.5% is about what the capital expenses money is allocated. So that's really a 10 times difference between the amount that's allocated for operating and the amount that's allocated for capital. And to give you a sense of scale, at Town Meeting TV, which CCTV operates, the regional government access channel, in 2022, we received $395,000 for operating and $137,000 for capital. Once the PUC is issued a certificate of public good for a cable operator, the negotiation begins between the cable operator and the access management organizations for how much capital there will be, what kind of channel capacity we might receive, where community drops for live meetings might go. And some of these conversations have been modernized over time, but they happen outside of the CPG process once the Public Utility Commission has said, you have permission to operate and you have to comply with the PEG rules. Please note that PEG fees are passed on to consumers. So the operators have the option not to pass it on, but they do. And so if you have a cable bill, you will see a PEG fee of roughly 5.5% appearing on your bill every month. Okay, so the trend line for cable television subscription is pretty similar to the trend line for landline subscriptions. Across the United States and Vermont, consumers are canceling those subscriptions in favor of internet-based entertainment and news sources. Because cable revenue is such an integral part of our funding structure, its steady decline has a significant impact on our operating budgets. For example, at Town Meeting TV, there's been a 19% decline of Comcast revenue between 2016 and 2023. Van appreciates the efforts of the Ways and Means Committee to modernize Vermont's telecommunications tax structure. We agree, it is long overdue. H657 proposes to increase the amount of PEG capital funding and to incorporate the requirement of a 1% capital fee, returning this requirement from side negotiations with the cable operators back into the CPG process. While this would help to address a portion of community media funding issues, the bill does not address this part of the bill does not address the central issue of declining cable revenue, which is having a significant impact. By proposing to move the administration of PEG capital funding into the Secretary of State's office, this part of H657 creates additional steps and a new administrative role for Van. For these reasons, Van doesn't support the 1% capital gross revenue charge in H657. And we respectfully request that you address the issue of community media's declining operating expenses, which, as I noted, are typically 10 times the amount received for capital. As members of the committee are aware, and here's where we mention H575, that would establish a new community media public, let me say that slowly, sorry, a new community media public benefit fund, funded by communication service providers in the state to ensure the equitable and sustainable financial support for PEG. It was developed from recommendations to the legislature in the PEG study and has been carefully vetted by legal experts and falls within the legislature's jurisdiction. We hope you will consider H575 as part of your larger discussion of the modernization of telecommunications taxes in Vermont. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Committee, we're likely going to go a little bit over into the noon hour today. Just want to give that caveat. Sorry about that. Any questions for Lauren Glenn before we go to our next witness? Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate you joining us. Is Christopher? Oh,
Scott Mackey, actually.
Scott,
First.
sorry.
Thank you.
Welcome, good to see you.
Thank you. My name's Scott Mackey. I'm with Leonine Public Affairs and here in Montpelier, and I'm here today representing CTIA, the Wireless Association, and that means here in Vermont, US Cellular, T-Mobile, AT&T, and Verizon, who are the facilities-based wireless providers providing service in Vermont. Our mission basically, and I do this work across the country for the industry, and our mission basically in terms of state and local tax policy is simply to try to make sure that wireless consumers are not burdened with excessive discriminatory taxes, and also that wireless companies are also not burdened with discriminatory taxes. Our mission is not to say we shouldn't pay taxes, but I think don't want to be singled out for taxes that other competitive businesses don't pay. So for my comments today, I'm going to very briefly mention the cloud tax. I've already testified before the committee. I think it was in the spring of last year when you were looking at the USF. So I'll very quickly go through the USF, and I'll spend most of my time talking about the property tax issue.
And it is possible our memory of spring is a little fuzzy.
And I will,
Mhm.
I did submit written testimony, but I won't burden you by going through it in as much detail as I did before. I mean, on the cloud tax, the industry doesn't really take a position on whether states should or should not tax remotely accessed software and the other types of software that would be covered by the bill. We do note that a lot of those costs are going to be borne by businesses, and a lot of them will be are taxes on businesses that will then use that, incorporate it into another product to a good or a service that's sold to the consumer or retail. And so if the committee is going to look at this, I guess we would request that you look at some kind of a exemption for business to business purchases, similar to when component parts or other things in the tangible world are incorporated into a product that's sold at retail, that there's not this pyramiding of the taxes. But in terms of the decision on whether or not to tax the service to the end user, that's not something that we take a position on. In terms of the changes to the State Universal Service Fund, I think I mentioned last year that the wireless industry would prefer to keep the imposition on a percentage basis. And I think the reason for that is that it would shift more of the burden paying the overall USF charge to wireless consumers. And some of that has to do with how we price our services, especially related to families and family share plans, where generally speaking, the more lines you have, the lower the price is for those third, fourth, and fifth lines. And so right now, if you just go with 70 cents per line and you have a family with 4 or 5 phones, they're going to be paying quite a bit more than they are today.
I'd say that right now we're discriminating against single people.
That is true. I guess it depends on how you view discrimination. Although I will say that, if you look at it solely for what people pay for the service, and, in terms of the causes of the decline of the USF, clearly the decline in wireline is key, but, it's not solely because of that. It's also, wireless prices have been going down because of competition. So we're actually, part of the reason why it's declined to 2.4% of retail charges is wireless prices have dropped, particularly as we market more of these family share plans. And we think that changing it from a percentage to a flat would also shift more of the burden onto residential users and off of businesses that tend to use a lot more wireline communications. But as I mentioned, those are our concerns. On the rest of the administrative issues, I think the draft I've seen really addresses most of them. I think you've clarified the definition of an access line. I think you've kept prepaid wireless so that not just so that it's fair to consumers, but also so that the retail merchants that sell the cards, as opposed to the carriers, don't have to reprogram their systems to have a flat charge and a percentage. So it helps the retailers by leaving it the way it is as you proposed in the bill. The other issue I made was administrative, giving us enough time to implement. And I think by putting a January 25 effective date, you address that. We also wanted to make sure that rate changes are controlled by the legislature and not sort of built into some kind of regulatory or other body, and you've kept that authority. And then in terms of 988, we like the fact that if you're going to add 988, that you not do it as a separate charge. It just administratively makes it easier for consumers. So let me shift over to the telephone property tax. And I know it's a very complicated issue, and I wasn't going to get into the weeds, but I may have to do a little bit because some of the questions that you raised that I might have some answers to that would help. So the wireless industry is opposed to the shift from municipal taxation of our personal property to statewide taxation of personal property. The real estate would be unaffected, so that we're only talking about changing the personal property. We feel like we should be treated the same as other competitive businesses, and that if a town elects to tax personal property, then we should pay the tax. And and for all businesses. And if a town elects to exempt personal property for all businesses, then we should have the same exemption that other types of businesses that have personal property in a town would pay. We do pay the tax in municipalities who have elected to tax that, and a lot of the bigger cities and towns in Vermont do have elected to tax it. So Barrytown, Brattleboro, Burlington, Montpelier, Rutland City and Town, St. Albans City and Town, Winooski. These are all communities where we are paying the tax. And I don't know what would happen to the revenues under this proposal, but we are paying the tax in those towns. And we have no problem paying the tax, but we feel like our property should be treated the same as other businesses, personal property, depending on what a town decides to do. In terms of, moving us into this tax that I think you said dated back to the 1940s, we don't see that as a modernization. In terms of the complexity for local assessors, I push back a little bit on the notion that this is a complex. For instance, I've got the Office of the Assessor in Burlington. They have basically a bunch of categories. They've got computer equipment, they've got furniture and fixtures, they've got machinery and equipment with a short, medium, or long life, and they have leasehold improvements. And what we're required to do is use the schedule. We report what we have for property in each of these categories to the assessor, and they fix the value. So it's not like there aren't guidelines for local assessors to use. And I think these are the same tax schedules that are used for other businesses that are subject to the business personal property tax in Burlington. So I don't think it's that complicated for the local listers to value if they use sort of common practice. And these are the same types of schedules that are used in many of the states. And, the other thing, the locals do use fair market value. So for instance, they also built in what's called a cost factor. So if I bought a piece of equipment that cost $50,000 in 2015, the starting point for that, they'll actually adjust that up based on inflation. So the starting point, it might get adjusted. It looks like in Burlington schedule, it'd be a 37% increase. So the starting point would be 50,000, 30% increase, and then it would be the number of year old. There's a depreciation factor. So there's a relatively standard way that local governments do this, not just in Vermont, but throughout the country. And it was mentioned earlier that many states do so-called centrally assess, which is having the tax department or a central entity do the valuation instead of locals. But actually, and I'm sorry I didn't submit it, but I'll leave this map with the committee. But and this is based on the NCSL report that the task force that you're a member of worked on and released in August. In the Northeast, so from sort of Pennsylvania and Maryland north, only 2 out of the 11 states centrally assess wireless property. 4 of them exempt it completely, and then the others, Vermont, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, and Pennsylvania, do use local assessment. So central assessment is much more common in the western states, but it's not that common for wireless property in the Northeast. And part of the reason of that is the whole idea behind central assessment is when you've got a network that's connected by wires or railroad lines, it's very difficult to value a strip of property going through a town if it's a right of way for a wire with poles, or if it's a railroad, or if it's a pipeline. And so, but with wireless, the way wireless is done, we have these network of cell sites that connect into to the backbone, and those cell sites are, a structure with a bunch of computer and switching equipment in it. So it's not that the need for central assessment, I think, when it comes to wireless is less clear than, say, it is for other types of businesses that are sort of connected by these networks of physical wires that go through many towns and cities. So see if there's anything else I wanted to address on the property tax. Yeah, so our preference would be obviously to keep local assessment. We do pay in jurisdictions where the local governments have decided that business personal property should be taxed. And we think that we should be treated like other competitive businesses and not being put into an antiquated tax that really predated, that was really started with a monopoly telecommunications industry where there was just one company. So I want to leave some time for my like folks from Comcast, but I'm happy to answer questions if you'd like.
I'm just trying to understand your assertion that you assessing the cloud tax on businesses the same way we would as on individuals is somehow discriminatory. I don't think I understand that.
Well, I think what I was talking about, if I'm a company and I buy a piece of machine, a piece of equipment that I then add it to something I'm making. So it's basically the supplies or the supply chain items. And then I sell that to the consumer. I don't have to pay sales tax on the component parts and pieces that I buy. The product I sell, the sales tax is imposed on the end consumer. Otherwise, what happens is I pay 6% on this widget that I put in, I pay 6% on this widget, and then all those taxes get built into the price and then are taxed again. So you basically have the 6% being imposed on multiple stages in the production process, or what the economists call pyramiding. So if I misspoke about that, what I was suggesting is that to the extent you have sale for resale or other types of exemptions already in your tax code that apply to tangible goods, if you're going to, and software for that matter, if you're going to do that to the cloud, if somebody's buying software that gets incorporated into another product that they're ultimately selling, that there should be a business to business exemption for that, so you don't have a tax on a tax.
I'm just trying to think through like things like a business using Zoom, right? Like, I don't think that gets incorporated into a product. I'm not trying to disavow what you're saying. I'm just trying to, I think it's pretty complicated.
I guess I was thinking more about, not so much in that context, but if you buy software from somebody, you use that software as part of a larger software product that you're selling, it shouldn't be taxed on both if the end sale of the software is taxable. I wasn't talking about, there are certain instances where businesses use products and services that they're not building into another product that they're selling. And so I wasn't trying to imply that there should be a blanket business to business exemption.
Thanks for the clarification.
Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Would you like to go? Christopher, hello.
Yes, hello, Madam Chair. Thank you for having me. For the record, I'm Kristen Christopher. I'm the Vice President of State Government Affairs for Comcast in Vermont.
And your colleague, Jean Russell, is
Yeah.
you, though you cannot see her because she is.
And so first, this is my first time before the committee, so thanks for having me.
Welcome.
Realizing that we're up against the time, I will do my best to be concise and brief. And I know that with some elements of this bill is changing, and so that might impact, some of the testimony.
Happy to have you back if you need to.
Yes, and so I'll say that at the outset. We are happy to come back. I'll give a high-level overview today on 3 different areas within the bill. Jean is our Associate Vice President of Tax Policy at Comcast, and I have her here really as a lifeline to jump in if I either screw something up or can't answer a question. So I appreciate that she was able to join virtually. And I'll just say, we can come back at any point to drill down on any of these areas. So please interrupt as I'm going through. So the 3 things, I'll focus my testimony on within H657. So first, the changes to the communications property taxes in Section 10. We know that those might be evolving. And so, I'll try to just do that at a very high level. The second would be the proposed PEG fee for capital expenditures in Section 11, and then the proposed changes to the state's right-of-way fees. So I'll jump right in on the property taxes. Scott did a great job at providing an overview, so I'm not going to repeat anything he just said in terms of how property taxes are assessed for certain communications providers in the state. We do pay our property taxes on the local level as well on our real property. And as you heard, the taxes vary municipality by municipality. And so taking into consideration the scope of H657 as drafted right now, we believe the intent of the bill is to shift the current methodology to the state. Our tax folks, did look at this and have some concerns that the local preemption wouldn't be clear as drafted. And so we would say, we're neutral on shifting to the state, but we would just want to ensure that the ability for localities to continue taxing on property would be preempted or removed from the bill. So that's just something we'd love to work with the committee on, just adding some of that clarification. Second is really getting to what the actual rate is. And so we did some internal analysis. So we are paying the local taxes right now. We're paying an effective tax rate of about 1.8% of our assessed value in Vermont, just across localities. And so obviously, if we were brought up to the 2.37% proposed fee that's on the statewide for telephone companies, that would be a significant increase for our tax liability in Vermont. And so we would just ask if the kind of goal of modernizing the telecom tax structure and achieving equity throughout the system under this bill, we would ask for the committee to consider lowering the telephone company's tax rate kind of at the rate that we're currently paying on the local level rather than bringing everybody up. And so I think that's for consistency. I know that obviously there's a whole host of different providers that would be impacted by this. I think we all have a common goal of broadband deployment and digital equity within the state. And so figuring out ways to really lower that burden would be something that we would be supportive of. Any questions on the property tax piece? Okay, I'll jump right
I'm
in.
impressed that you could add it up across the state, because I think we would really struggle to be able to do that on our end. So I appreciate that you did that math and might want to see that math at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. We can follow up.
Thank you.
Moving on to the section 11, which would be new tax of 1% of cable companies' gross revenue for additional capital funding for PEG. This section would also direct the PUC to amend all existing certificate of public goods to include this new tax. But first, at the outset, we want to say we recognize the importance of PEG access to communities in Vermont. We have long, provided funding for these organizations through a fee that's passed on to our customers. My goal is to really level set how the process for PEG capital funding currently works right now, why we think it works well, and then just briefly highlight some legal conflicts, which ultimately leads to our opposition of this provision. Lauren did a great job of actually giving an overview, so I'm going to skip over some of my notes, but everybody's aware that we do pay a 5% franchise fee in Vermont that goes towards operational costs for PEG and for the Vermont AMOs. I will say, Vermont is unique when compared to other states where instead of allocating only a portion of that 5% franchise fee toward PEG operating costs, Vermont does allocate 100% of that 5% to Vermont AMOs. And so that is, it shows the commitment that the PUC has given toward PEG organizations in the state. Just to give a little context, Comcast paid about $6 million to Vermont AMOs in 2023 in operating funding under this 5% franchise fee. That figure does not include capital costs, as Lauren had stated in her testimony. So we fund that outside of the 5% franchise fee, and that's done through negotiations with the individual AMOs as directed by the PUC. So for capital costs, just again in context, in FY23 we paid an additional $819,000, and just over the last decade we've paid about $73 million to Vermont AMOs for both operating and capital. So I think what's good to know right now is the current process of the Vermont PUC rule puts forth for capital funding. It's really in line, and quite frankly, it's what's mandated by the Federal Cable Act. And the Federal Cable Act requires that such funding be limited to no more than what is adequate and reasonable. And it has to be based on community needs and interests. And so under the PUC rule, this is a negotiation process between the cable operator and the individual AMO. And there's certain criteria that has to be considered within those negotiations. So it's the community needs of PEG that the funding is intended to address, how community needs have been ascertained, how the needs will be met by the requested PEG capital funding, and then also the impact, because as we said, the cost can be passed through to subscribers. That impact on subscribers has to be also taken into consideration within that negotiation. And so this process really sets up, it doesn't raise any more revenue than is needed and is presented by the individual AMOs. And so it really is specific to what those capital needs are at the time. And the process has worked well. And I think that there's the most important piece of this is under the PUC process, AMOs can come back during the length of agreements and ask for additional capital needs if there are additional capital needs that have come up. Obviously things evolve over time, equipment might become outdated. So that flexibility is built into the system. And then also within the Comcast CPG before the state, there is a provision that allows reevaluation of PEG digital equipment needs and other PEG access related cable system improvements at least twice during that CPG. So we do think that there's flexibility built within the current framework for addressing additional capital needs. And then, lastly, just as drafted, I think uniformly requiring an arbitrary 1% of cable revenues where it's not directly tied to an actual need or demonstrated need by an individual AMO, that would violate the Federal Cable Act that I referenced before. So there's really no plausible connection between the 1% and what the needs may be. So we would just ask that this section be taken out of the bill, and then we can continue to have the negotiation process that's set forth in the PUC rule. Obviously, that is very technical. I'm happy to follow up more on that in writing, but that's a pretty high-level overview. And the last thing I would say is the bill also would kind of allow the PUC to go in and unilaterally modify agreements and negotiations contracts that we already have in place with the individual AMOs. And so, it's something that the bill would kind of displace these arm's length agreements that, would require us to provide substantially more funding that we already agreed to with an individual AMO. So we think that would also kind of unlawfully impair an existing contract.
Representative Taylor, you had a question?
You said that Comcast pays 5%.
Yes.
That's actually coming from the customer, right?
Yes, so it's passed through to the customer.
Yeah, so you're not paying it, we're paying.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
just wanted to make.
No, and I said that in my, I don't want to
Make that clear.
yeah, absolutely. No, it is certainly, and that's why the cost to the customer has to be taken into account during the capital expenditure negotiation process, because there is an impact to the end customer here. Okay, lastly, I'm sorry, I know that you're all probably hungry, trying to get to lunch. So
That's not your fault.
So everything that was the testimony that was given before is really helpful even for me. So section 13 of the bill will require communication service providers to now start paying the fair market value base charge for the state-owned rights of way. So implementing the right-of-way fee that has been on the books, obviously taking away that existing waiver. I think generally the concern for Comcast is the reference to what a reasonable charge or payment in the current statute is. It's extremely broad and really difficult to estimate what the impact of that would be in a meaningful way. And I know that Ted kind of had touched on that within his fiscal impact. So that's, something I would just throw to the committee. I think most importantly, there's a fairness and legal question here for us. This bill exempts not only CUDs, but other providers that kind of fall within that definition that's listed in the bill. And it raises a red flag for us, not only for fairness, but really for legal issues. And I can follow up in more detail in writing, but this is, specifically violates Section 253 of the Federal Communications Act. And the FCC and courts have repeatedly held that Section 253 preempts state and local legal requirements that materially inhibits or limits the ability of any competitor or potential competitor to compete in a fair and balanced legal and regulatory environment. So this Section 253 doesn't permit states to exempt a favored class of providers from different financial burdens that others would have to pay. And so we think this is really setting up a legal issue here if we're required to pay certain fees while other classes of providers are not. Again, technical, legal, happy to follow up with more detail in writing with the answers. So I think I will leave it at that. And again, I haven't submitted written testimony, but we will follow up with more details in writing. I think overall, just the bill kind of coupling right-of-way fees, PEG fees, changes in property taxes, it would create a significant tax liability increase for Comcast, in addition to some legal issues we were brought into. So would appreciate any consideration of this testimony. And again, happy to come back on any of these pieces and drill down further. You're welcome.
Representative Anthony.
As I read the right-of-way article, it's not particularized to any particular user. So in that sense, you're not being singled out and it doesn't violate the FCC rule. It's anybody who uses the right-of-way ought to contribute to its maintenance. Simple as that.
And so I think, that's a great point. So in the bill, it does exempt CUDs and another class of providers that fall under the definition of, and I don't have it in front of me.
Broadband.
Act 71, correct? So, our big goal is parity, right? And if we have to pay taxes, we at least want fairness across the tax system, that all of our competitors are being taxed in the same manner capacity.
Yeah, no.
Thank you. So what we're going to do next steps on this bill is if someone in this room or outside of this room would want to see the next version of the bill before we pick it up again, if you could give your name to Sorsha, that would be great. And so we'll circulate a next version and then happy to line up testimony from anyone who's interested in testifying. Thanks. Thank you. And then we are back here in this room, please very promptly at 1:10, because we have our joint hearing about education finance. We have school board members, superintendents, business managers, really eager to dive in with us on these issues. So please, let's all be here to listen.